Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of HerdCon's Book Chats. We're going to do something a little bit different today. So usually, Megan and I will read a book and then we'll talk about a book and reflect on it. And this is a rare chance where we're actually going to we read a book and we're going to talk about it with the author and talk about ask her some questions about her experiences and her work. But before we get to that, the author we're going to talk about is Cherokee author Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle. And before we do that, we have to thank sponsors and disclaimers and all that. So, the opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions and beliefs of Marshall University Libraries, the Department of English, the College of Liberal Arts, or HerdCon, but we do thank them for giving us a job. And also, Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle's visit to Marshall is made possible by the support of the College of Liberal Arts, University Libraries, and the Department of English. And we'd also like to thank the A.E. Stringer Visiting Writers Series and its coordinator, Sarah Henning, for making this possible. And Megan, you got the bio.
Sure. So Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle is an enrolled citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and resides in Koala, North Carolina. She holds degrees from Yale University and the College of William and Mary. She is the author of Even As We Breathe, a finalist for the Weatherford Award, named one of NPR's best books of 2020 in 2021, and the recipient of the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award. Clapsaddle established Bird Words LLC in 2022 and works as an independent contractor and consultant. She also helped launch Confluence, an Indigenous Writers Workshop series, which seeks to bring Indigenous writers to the Koala boundary, Cherokee, North Carolina, to work with aspiring writers. She is currently serving as Shepherd University's Appalachian Heritage Writer in Residence.
Welcome, Annette. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So maybe just to start, and I always feel it's like that silly question that we ask authors, like, why did you decide to become an author? And I was kind of interested also in how your experiences growing up in Koala in Western North Carolina as Cherokee, how did that inform your experiences?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think it was a conscious decision to become a writer. I have been writing since I was little. I still have these little books we made in elementary school that are made out of cardboard and taped together and lined pages in between. So that for me is more of a compulsion. It's part of who I am. But I will say that there was a point where I realized that it would be important for me to be writing about the place that I'm from, the culture that I'm from. I always joke that when I was probably about 8 years old, I decided I was writing the great American novel in the Pink Diary, and it was about a girl growing up in a lighthouse in Maine. And I hadn't been to Maine. I hadn't been to a lighthouse. And so the point when I realized that I could write authentically about my community was really when my mother gave me a book by another Native author, and it was so honest, right? And I live in a beautiful part of the country in Western North Carolina. It's right at the entrance to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Appalachian Mountains, as you know, are beautiful. And so I think just that environment influences me on so many levels and my writing on so many levels, not just the beauty of the place, but the complexity of the people. There are so many stories to tell about Appalachian people in general, but Cherokee people specifically. My novel is the first novel published by an enrolled citizen of our tribe. So there's lots of stories, obviously, that haven't been told to the general public, at least in that form. And so it's really exciting for me to have the opportunity to contextualize who we are as a people in a present day, as opposed to continually speaking about Cherokee culture in the past tense, which tends to happen a lot.
was just thinking, I grew up in Georgia, in a place called Cherokee County, Georgia, where there were no Cherokee people. But all of the all the high school sports teams were named after something Cherokee related. But passing through Cherokee, North Carolina, I was always interested in how it is like there's tourism, but there's also community, and there's this kind of strange layering. There was clearly this point where there was this fascination with like something related to the Disney Peter Pan film, where they're like Peter Pan's gift shops or stores, and they've been long abandoned. And then you've got there's a huge casino there and all that. I just kind of wondering about like, it just seems like a fascinating and also kind of disjunctive kind of existence to have there.
Yes, that's very astute of you upon your visits to Cherokee. It's very layered. So I actually grew up in what I call like a tourism household. My family owned small businesses on the Qualla boundary that cater to tourists. And my grandfather, my dad's father, while he was actually a 2-term chief for our tribe elected, he also was a world heavyweight wrestling champion.
Oh, cool.
And he wrestled under the persona of the Cherokee Chief, which was all commodified, commercialized, fake identity, like that whole Hollywood identity of what it means to be Native. So in Cherokee proper, we have definitely grappled with what is authentic versus what keeps our economy alive. And prior to Indian gaming, it was only that kind of tourism. And so it was a means of survival. So you would see individuals do what they call chiefing, which is set up these teepees on roadsides and put on headdresses and take pictures with tourists for tips. None of that has anything to do with our actual culture. Because, we didn't live in teepees, we didn't wear headdresses, all these things, but that's what people expected to see when they came to, again, something that's false, which is a reservation, right? We are not technically a reservation. We bought our land back several times over. So I think it's fascinating to think about the economy of Cherokee as a commentary on sovereignty as well. So when we entered the gaming industry, late 90s, early 2000s. We were able to then basically become what others may understand better as like investors, right? So with the dividends from the tribe, from gaming, the tribe now runs its own hospital system, its own school system. So services that we were largely dependent on the federal government for in the past, which often meant that those were pretty subpar services. Health, some of the Indian health services years ago did not have the best reputations. Now those services are incredible, and we've just done, I think, a great job in general of investing back in our community. So it's not reliant on a tourism that caters to that false narrative of who we are. There's still some of it, but there's lots of examples of changes.
In my visit, I was driving to Mingo Falls and saw the high school. And it's like, wow, that looks like an awesome high school with lots of cool stuff in it. Yeah. So, yeah.
When you're talking about your grandfather going and putting on this headdress and trying to fit into like that box of what other people expect him, it reminded me a part of your novel when County has just shown up to the Grove Inn, and he says, I better get out of here before they figure out what I am. And that reminded me, I was tutoring a Middle Eastern student, and he asked me, am I black? And I stopped, and I said, no, I would think that you're Middle Eastern. He was like, that's not an option. So it brought me a mind of this. What draws you to those themes of like ambiguity of not fitting into those boxes?
Yeah, great question. I think it's so fascinating that we, I don't know, I'm going to say this real broadly, like we in America maybe, this may be like worldwide, love labels. We love to try to figure out where someone belongs and also where we belong. There's so many people who are searching for an identity so they can label themselves of where they belong. And I think that search for labeling people often causes our biggest problems, right? And so with a novel specifically, the true part of the novel is that in the summer of 1942, the Grove Park Inn did hold access diplomats and foreign nationals as prisoners of war. And when I found out that piece of information, it was striking to me. One, because I'd never heard that before, and I grew up in the area and friends with lots of historians, including my husband, who's a historian, and none of us were really familiar with that history. But what struck me so much about that was that so here you have this setting of opulence, right? This is where presidents vacation. This is where billionaires vacation. You have this, and it turns into this prison. And then you have diplomats who all of a sudden are prisoners. And then this is also an hour east of a sovereign nation, which is Cherokee. So the setting itself was all about ambiguity, all about complexity, all about who belongs and when do they belong there, right? How do we make those determinations? And so it's the questions, I think, for me. Why are we searching so hard for these kind of labels that seem a little bit manufactured, and as compared to deciding our community population based on human spirit, right? So.
And I think that's also something that we see for County when he's not able-bodied enough to go serve in the war, but yet we see him being able-bodied enough to do manual labor, and that continues to be a point of contrition in the book. Is this idea of, well, you're disabled, but you're not disabled enough.
Right, yeah. And I think his family recognizes and his community recognizes that he's abled in so many ways, right? That this one label that excludes him from military service doesn't really exclude him from much else.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's out on the river. He's doing all sorts of things in it. I think one of the, and it maybe it's like it's a personal thing, but it's one of my favorite scenes in the novel, which doesn't seem like a big deal, is when the first night he's there at the Grove Park Inn, which I will say, it mentions there at the Grove Park Inn, I like to reference, did you know in the 1940s it was used? I need to make sure and cite your book when I do that. And he gets a chance to have the buffet basically, and just how, and this is like it's an excellent writing. It's an excellent food scene. It makes me hungry. Makes me want the veggies and the fried chicken, but also it just is so startling, the economic disparity of Asheville and the Qualla boundary, and lots of other parts of Western North Carolina. I assume that's intentional on your part, but could you speak to that, just that striking economic disparity?
Sure, yeah. It was important to be able to explain that even though these places are geographically very close, economically they're not, especially the Grove Park property itself. And I'm thinking about that scene, and I remember doing a lot of research around what foods are available during this time period because of rationing and all of those things, and just confirming all those details. But I also remember conversations with older folks back home who talk about whether they talk about wartime or the Great Depression. Or stories of people talking about the Great Depression, saying nothing changed for us. It was pretty much the same. We all had gardens anyway, and I keep thinking back to that as both. I think it's tempting to think of the haves and the have-nots, but the truth of it is we just have in different ways, and in times of real struggle. What one may term the have-nots all of a sudden actually become the haves, right? This ability to to take care of your community, doing whatever you need to survive, to know how to raise a garden, to know how to fish and hunt and all of those things. But it is so interesting how clearly one community can, have access to so much right next door to people who have nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because nowadays people associate Asheville with being like a very progressive place and the liberal, perhaps the liberal bleeding heart of the Appalachia. But it's like, there's a bunch of rich people, very rich people who live there.
Yeah, it is the blue county on the map, right, on election day. It's a lot of people that have moved in to the area as well. But I want to say this carefully because I don't want to be misquoted on this one for sure, but it does take an amount of privilege to experience freedom, right? To be outspoken about freedom. I should say it that way, right? Yeah. And so I think you see that in Asheville a lot, that there is amount of freedom that folks have there because they have the privilege to have that freedom. So you may see similar beliefs or core values, really, in communities around, but there's a little bit more risk about being open about that, I think.
Absolutely.
And I was also thinking about, I had read it was from the Super Scenic Motorway by Anna Wishart about the Blue Ridge Parkway, and there's a chapter about Cherokee, and it basically, I'm oversimplifying things, but basically Knoxville and Asheville said, we're going to find a way to get the money, and Cherokee doesn't get any money. Or just have that. And I believe they wanted to, there was an original plan to have the Blue Ridge Parkway end going through one of the valleys and all the agriculture that the Cherokee were doing, but they're like, they needed the land to grow the food. And so it ends where it ends, right in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So, but yeah, there's a reason for that, that economic disparity, and people did it.
Yeah,
so.
It's very much engineered. I will say, and this is something I actually am in the middle of trying to research a little bit more. That was during the time period that my grandfather was chief in Cherokee, and he was part of those negotiations for the Blue Ridge Parkway and where it ended and all of that. Because, he even saw that it's a system, right? And we have to figure out how to be part of that system if we're going to survive economically.
While we're on the subject of power dynamics, I have a couple questions about Peter specifically.
Okay.
Especially in his ability to kill the little girl and then frame County, who we think is his friend up to that point. Is Peter a reflection of the power dynamic and control of these white military men and how much their power over even the workers?
Sure, yeah. I think in a lot of ways, yes. I wanted to be careful in the novel that we don't see all of the white people as the villains of the story, to simplify, and all the people of color as the heroes, right? I wanted to really to get at the complexity, of human beings. But also for Peter, it is very much like, it's not just who he is personally, it's who he has been trained to be, right? And how he has been trained to see others, especially when we think about the little girl during a time of war, really othering individuals who are from an enemy country. And then in terms of County, it's a really dehumanizing viewpoint, and we still see this, I think, in some relationships, that intellectually you can see someone interact with somebody from a different culture or whatnot, and be friendly and casual with them, but it can often be very superficial because deep down they still have not humanized them to the same level that they do people they associate with more often. And I want to kind of capture that with Peter, that we think he can be a friend, right? But he's just been trained to look out for a certain mission, you know, to put it that way. So I really struggled with thinking about Peter and how he would react and why. But yeah.
So my follow-up question is more of my own narrative speculation while I was reading it. When Essie and County are originally on their way, there's talk of children going missing around here. Is Peter a serial killer?
Oh, no, I don't think. Well, I'm not going to say no. I gave you no proof he wasn't, right?
Yeah.
So depends on what genre you like to read. If you're a true crime buff like I am, that was not my intent that he's a serial killer. However, I mean, you're not too far off with this because one of my intentions was to give a nod, and not too overtly, but to give a nod to the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement, and to look at this little girl as a person of color, a woman who's gone missing and so easily got swept under the rug, right? For the sake of ease, and so I'm not going to put all the blame on Peter, but it is a commentary on how often it is happening now, and likely has always happened.
Definitely timely with out west, the 14-year-old girl recently being discovered dismembered.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's like the mystery of it's so obvious. Like, yeah, County didn't do that, and it is like, of course we know that he would not be that kind. He's not even been in the presence of any children to murder them, and yet he's kind of, someone can just suggest it and they'll think he's the suspect. I mean, that's not the mystery in the book, but it is this kind of really infuriating thing just to see it as a reader.
Yeah, and as a reader, you are inside his head, so you know him, right? You know who he's really all about. But it is true. It doesn't take much for us as human beings to start believing a line of thinking, depending on what our past experiences have been and also our value set. And I mean, I'm definitely guilty of it, right? Like, there's so many. I mentioned true crime. I love true crime. But I know that there's a lot of documentaries now that are coming out that are telling the full story of murders or whatnot that I heard about when I was younger. And I knew who the killer was and I knew who was guilty and all that when I was younger. And then you hear the whole story and how different narratives of people really shaped what we believed, in popular culture. And we were wrong, or I was wrong. I can say for sure I was wrong on some things.
And while we're on a little bit of crime, I don't know if it's technically a crime, but also the power dynamic of being poor and being pushed into do things. I'm thinking about County not wanting to talk to the Japanese diplomat, not from racism, but of fear.
Right.
And yet, once his grandmother dies and he's in dire financial straits, I just thought that was a really nice way to talk about how someone who would never commit a crime might. You should never say, I would never, because you don't know what situation you're going to be in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Again, I think a lot about values and where our lines are, and the value of caring for a loved one, someone who's special to you, someone who's taking care of you, is far more important than stealing from trying not to steal from a store or something, right? I think, I'm guilty of at times saying, "Oh, that's something I could never fathom doing." But until you are in that situation and relying on your own value set, I think we just don't know what we're capable of.
I was interested in how the way you develop characters in the novel, and obviously, I think being your first release novel, I think it's interesting that there's some unlikable characters in the novel, which I always think I want people to like this, but they have they're really kind of terrible. I think
good.
Bud is kind of terrible. Essie is really terrible. And
We'll fight over that one, but okay.
and County, I'm with him. I understand where he's coming from. But he's also very frustrating in his naivety, even though he's looking back at how naive he was. He's acknowledging his naivety. And Essie's being very naive too. So it's just kind of, thinking about how you try to balance, how you think about creating characters and how you balance to give them, they're three-dimensional characters, obviously. So
Yeah, I love this question. I love this discussion about, because oftentimes, I'll talk about Bud specifically in a second, but oftentimes I like to get into a big debate, especially in classrooms, over like there's an Essie camp and there's a County camp about who likes who. Did you want to?
Can I ask, is that along gendered lines?
So it is, but unexpectedly so. Really? And it's also changes with ages too. So here's for background for anyone that's listening. County has feelings for Essie. You know that pretty early on. And Essie basically turns him down. We won't get into all the details, but they remain very close friends. And again, that goes back to my emphasis on labels. I never wanted them to be a romantic pair or just a friend pair. I want it to be really muddy and more realistic, to life.
It's complicated.
It's complicated, right? But also, like, I'll go into a classroom and have like a high school classroom and have younger girls super upset with Essie, and that's my favorite when that happens because I was like, why? And they're like, County's so sweet, all this, and I'm like, so okay, they're the same age, they're both teenagers, and County's made some mistakes, right? Does Essie not get to make mistakes? And also, ladies, just because a guy likes you doesn't mean that you have to just be like, oh, yes, well, he likes me, so I'm all his, right? So those are the kind of, playful arguments that we like to have. When I think about Essie, I didn't want, I mean, if you know anything about me, you know I'm not going to have a weak female character or one that just kind of gives in to the male protagonist for a traditional love story. And I think about Cherokee women in general. I can say this, I don't like to use stereotypes or blanket statements about anyone, but I don't know any Cherokee women who kind of are super passive about life in general. So I knew she would have to be strong in her own way, even if it's going the wrong direction. But I wanted to talk about Bud on this question because I am always like very mindful of stereotypes of Cherokee characters. But I think that's just a good rule of thumb in general for a writer because it gets you into complexity versus like a flat character. So originally Bud, who's County's uncle, was really written just as the reason for pushing County away because he is a jerk, right? Yeah. He's not somebody I want to spend a lot of time around.
I've known somebody like him, and I don't ever see them again.
Yes, exactly. And so I wrote, a draft, or not the full novel, but started writing it, and I was like, but that's not fair to him. Like, I need to know why he's acting like this, right? Whether I accept that he acts like this or not, something has caused him to be such a jerk. And by pushing myself to do that just for character development, it changed the whole trajectory of the novel, as you know. Like, it caused a conflict to come up that I hadn't originally intended. So that was a really cool learning experience for me as a writer to see that if you do the work of really making sure that your characters are rounded out, then it can affect the whole plot itself. And the other thing about Bud that I like to say when I have this opportunity is that he is portrayed early on as also having a drinking problem, and then we see his health deteriorate later. And I did that on purpose. He's not an alcoholic, but there is a stereotype about Native people being alcoholics or alcoholism being, rampant in Indian country. And I wanted to kind of to play on this knowledge that I have of what sometimes happens, which is, this is a personal story for me because my aunt was diabetic. And when her sugar was super low, and she was in public, and she was phenotypically, she looked more Cherokee than I do, right? She had dark hair, dark skin, very obvious in our area that she was Cherokee. So when her sugar was low, she would present like she was drunk, speech slurred, things like that. And immediately that's what people assumed because she was Cherokee. And of course that always bothered me for obvious reasons. And so when I think about Bud, I wanted readers to think, oh, he's just an alcoholic, right? But to kind of, if you're really paying attention closely to some of the details, you realize that's not what was going on. Did he drink early on? Yeah, but that's not what is wrong. Yeah. Right.
I mean, he's such a character so racked with guilt.
Yes.
And it's just he's like, just the scenes of him as he's dying. It's just this kind of grief that he has and all these mixed up things. And I find County a frustrating character, but just rereading it and getting it, I was proud of him for standing up for himself, for both Bud and Esty. I was like, good for you, County. And you feel like you've grown. But yeah, it's just a really rough ending for Bud. Mm-hmm. And yeah. But I think obviously in depicting death, you don't shy away from the reality of it.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
I don't have the question. Some of my questions have already been answered throughout our conversation. But there also is like this undercurrent of mental health, which I didn't fully put together until we get to the end when we find out what really happened to County's dad. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested to know, like, was the military lying about what happened to protect his family from the shame of suicide, or was this like a benefits thing?
I don't know if it was it. It's interesting to contextualize it like that. So I'm not sure at that point that the military would even use the word shame, right? Sure. Because just things have changed so much in terms of our understanding of mental health. But I do think it's this preservation of honor, mm-hmm. right? And I think it's more so, it's less so the military. I think the military is like, this is what happened, and really don't care. And this is all in my head, by the way. These are fictional people, right? Yeah. But who does really have that shame and really worried about the story that will specifically be passed on to County are Bud and Leeshy, County's grandmother, right? That we want to have an honorable story to pass on. And, and that is tied into this long history of Native Americans serving in the U.S. military at greater percentages than any other segment, even before we were U.S. citizens. And there's a lot of pride in Native communities over military service. And that's what I imagine they want to preserve over discussing mental health, because in 1942, they're not talking about mental health. And I think suicide in particular is something that people just try to, I don't want to say cover up, but just not even address, right? They just make up their own narratives about things. Yeah.
And I was thinking also about that you're not, even as we breathe, checks a lot of boxes off in the best way possible. You could assign it to lots of different classes. And I was thinking, like, how do you see yourself as an Appalachian writer, a Cherokee/Native writer, and how this is also this novel is also a disability narrative.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I love that it can be assigned to a lot of classes for a writer. That's great. I don't like when I'm writing. I'm never like, oh, I'm going to write an Appalachian novel, or I'm going to write So it's the narrative that comes out. It's in fact, I just texted a friend about this. That something that I find is interesting right now. And I'll be careful what I say, but there are some words and labels and acronyms that folks aren't using now, right? Because they're scared for good reason, and so when I go places for the book, sometimes my talks will be billed as Native author, or it's Women's History Month, or whatever. And I just texted somebody, and I'm like, oh, like all of a sudden, I'm just a writer, and that's interesting too, right? Because I certainly am somebody who is pro talking about Native history and Native present, right? Or Appalachia and the complexity of Appalachia. But it's so interesting that even doing that work is still labeled, right? So, I do like, this is the only good thing I think that's happening out of all this, is that I am a writer, first and foremost. But I think it just says something to the fact, when you're like, what kind of narrative is this? I'm glad that it's hard to pin down, right? Because what I do want to do is represent a complexity. So I think it fits all or I hope that it fits all of the boxes.
It's just kind of a weird novel. It's not it is, I guess it's a coming of age narrative, but it's not County is the hero or anything like that. So I think it has that, it sits in this kind of interesting space where it does a lot of things.
I think part of that is, I taught high school for 12 years. And so I'm always reading literature with my students that, coming of age literature, all the things that we teach, right? And so I was always in conversation with those texts while I was writing. Like, I don't want to do that, right? Like, I want to know what that is. And then I want to maybe just take a different turn and see if I can take a different turn. Because the truth, you hear there are these quotes about every story's already been written. And so while I believe that's probably true, I want to see if I can find another one, So trying to take little turns from that path.
Yeah, it was interesting. I felt there was kind of a modernist vibe to it. You mentioned obviously Thomas Wolfe, and there's some mention of Hemingway, and it couldn't quite pin down it, but there's Essie feels like a character. Feels a little bit. She's a lot of things. She feels like a little a kind of character in a Fitzgerald novel, and I was kind of wondering if that kind of that first half of the 20th century American authors, those things had any sort of influence on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are the writers I love. Those are the writers I first really started studying. And those are some of the writers that stayed at the Grove Park, right? Which is kind of cool. I think when I think about the Grove Park, it's this feel of this era of literature, right? And even if a book is set later or much, much later, if it was set present day, I don't think you can get away from that kind of feel. A really cool side story related to that is that the room that they hang out in is room 447 because there's no guests or no one staying there. And they build their own culture there. So when I wrote the book, I knew that that room 447, if it existed, would exist in the old part of the inn, the historic part of the inn. The numbers 4 and 7 are important cultural numbers for the Cherokee. So that's the room, why I chose the room number. Had to make sure it would have existed. After the novel came out during COVID, took a while to get back to the Grove Park, and was there with a friend, and we decided to find the room, because I didn't actually see room 447 when I wrote. And the elevator operator took us up to the 4th floor, and I guess she assumed we were going for this purpose. We didn't tell her why we were there. The doors opened, and she pointed down the hall, and she said, "That's where the Fitzgeralds stayed when they were here. If they were, while they were here, we opened up 2 rooms adjoining, so those are their rooms." And we walked down the hall to find the plaque for the Fitzgeralds. And if that is true that they opened up 2 rooms, it would have been right next to Essie and County's 447, which was just sweet. Different time period.
Yeah.
One's real, one's fake. But
I was, with these kind of community spaces or sacred spaces, 447, the waterfall with the cave behind it. It's particularly heartbroken when County returns to it, and it's an office for Army officers. It's been painted over. It's been for just another layer, and all that they built up is gone. So that was a bummer.
Yes, that was definitely a metaphor for destroying native cultures, right? So they created in the room. There's games, there's literature, there's music, there's dance, all of the components, that make up what we think of as the culture. And then for the military to come in and destroy it. That was a pretty overt metaphor on my part.
Yeah.
I want to say that I found Essie to be very refreshing. I've read a lot of Appalachian literature, and there's always this tug between I want to stay, but I want to go. And I didn't feel like Essie wanted to stay at all.
Yeah.
And as someone who grew up in a small Appalachian town who absolutely did not want to stay at all, felt no longing for that, I loved seeing another Appalachian woman who wasn't struggling to stay.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Again, that comes a lot from teaching high school students who, and you hear both ends, or you hear people who are conflicted, but mostly young people you hear, "I'm going," and a lot do come back or don't leave, and that's fine. I wanted to very clearly say, you can stay or you can leave, and that is fine. County hangs out, and that's cool. Nothing, neither one is better or less than for doing that. So I appreciate that comment.
And then as you they both live full lives.
Right,
So
yeah.
This was the first story of their lives. And so maybe like a final question, so cheesy one, but what advice do you have for young aspiring authors?
Sure. I mean, my advice is always go to workshops if you can. There are more and more workshops for young people too, which is great. I always say I go to the Appalachian Writers Workshop as often as I can at Hyman University in Kentucky. Hyman Settlement School in Kentucky, and they also have a young writers workshop now associated with it. Ironwood is the name of that. So I really recommend that to definitely work on your own work, but to learn from other writers and to be in community with other writers. I think it's super important. And I was talking to a class earlier today here at Marshall that you have to be able to take feedback from people.
Yes.
And it's not that you have to accept all feedback as, then this will change what I write. It's to be able to hear it and to consider it, and then at some point develop enough to know when it's right for you and not. And that's tough too, right? To know, to be confident but not cocky. And that's what being a writer really is. And then the other thing I'll just say is patience. If you told the girl who was writing that novel about the lighthouse in Maine, that wasn't going to be her first novel she gets published, she'd probably be very upset with you about that. But writing it's just a long, long process, and you have to be able to take the feedback and let things rest. And if it's a compulsion for you, then you are a writer.
And any other upcoming projects you want to mention or endeavors, anything?
Sure. I'm always working on novels, but nothing is coming out on the bookstore, in the bookstore next month. But I will say, in terms of new work that's out, I have an essay in Troublesome Rising, which is about the floods in eastern Kentucky in 2022. And then in general, I'm an editor for a series editor for the University Press of Kentucky's writers series that focuses on diverse voices in Appalachia. So there's a lot of titles that are coming out. They're Appalachian Futures series that have some great titles coming out. I'm really excited about one that is, it's an academic title. Very academic work, but it's they've found, these researchers and writers found firsthand accounts of Native women speaking out and acting politically when the Spanish were coming through the region. And it was tied to an artifact that was found too. It's very, very cool. It's super academic, but it's very, very cool. Yeah.
We'll make sure and link that in the description. So if anybody's watching this want to check that out. So, but Annette, thank you very much for your time. It's been great talking to you. Any last thoughts?
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. And Annette's novel, Even As We Breathe, highly recommend it. And you can find your author's website also has links to articles and things that you've done. So, all right. Thank you very much, everybody.